Welcome to episode 24 of the Impactus podcast. We're here to equip you as men for a life of purpose and godly impact. My name is Kirk Giles. I am joined today by Steve McCready. Steve has spoken at a number of our conferences over the last couple of years, has written articles for the Impactus website, and he is just an all-around nice guy who happens to be a pastor in St. Thomas, Ontario. Steve, good to see you, my friend.
Hi, Kirk. It's great to be with you, and good to see you guys. Thanks for joining us.
So, Steve, you're Irish. You're an Irish pastor who's living in St. Thomas, Ontario, who's about to become an Australian during a pandemic. Does that pretty much sum up your life these days?
Yeah, absolutely. I have 3 passports. So I got a British passport, an Irish passport, and amazing to me, last year they gave me a Canadian passport. So I got these 3 passports. And so I like to say that I am the Jason Bourne of Christian ministry. Unfortunately, though, I don't have a Swiss bank account with a whole bunch of cash stashed away. But yeah, I'm a bit of a global guy. I have a huge heart for God's kingdom across the world. And probably the best way to understand me, Kirk, is that I'm a missionary who gets paid to do the work of a pastor. And so, my wife and I very much see ourselves as people who have been sent by our church in Belfast, and that we're these kind of missionary global people. And we've been here for 10 years in Canada. And we work as pastors, which is great fun, and the pay's okay, as you know. But Monday to Friday, that frees us up to live into God's kingdom and love our neighbors and be on mission.
And you've got some changes happening in your life. For those who may have met you at one of the conferences over the last couple of years, you are in the process of moving out of Canada, right?
Yeah. So over the course of the last couple of months, we have accepted an invitation to come and be pastors in Perth in Western Australia, which is the most isolated city in the world, apparently. And of course, there's lots of sharks, spiders, and crocodiles and all that kind of stuff. So we're heading into a massive adventure. And our kids are okay with it. My wife and I go back and forward. And why would we leave St. Thomas? It's awesome here. We're 10 minutes from the beach. But that's just how we're wired. I think God just uniquely wired us to keep seeking after his heart. And we just feel that this is him leading us at this point.
That's so cool. I'm so excited for you guys, and know that God's going to use you in some great ways as you serve him there.
Well, that's awesome. And I mean, the very first thing I did, actually, as soon as I accepted the role, was I reached out to the guys at Promise Keepers Impactus and said, hey, are you going to boot me off things, or can I still hang around and do some stuff and write some things? And they were very kind and said, no, we'd love you. We'll figure out. I don't know how we're going to figure out all the back end stuff, but yeah, it's going to be great. I'm excited to continue friendship with our church here in St. Thomas, but also with God's people in Canada and with Impactus in particular.
That's great. So one of our topic of our conversation today is going to be on the whole idea of friendship. And you've been doing some doctoral studies, and you actually chose friendship as the topic of your doctoral studies. That does not strike me as like the most common thing that people choose to study at in something like that depth. So why on earth would you ever choose a topic of friendship for a doctoral study?
That's such a good question. And yeah, there are not a lot of people who think that that's even worthy of doctoral studies. It came out of my own journey. At the time I just turned 40, and what was going on in my life was just this sense of like, why do I feel so stuck? I feel at 40 that I'm not growing anymore. My walk with God, my relationship with Jesus. Like, why am I still stuck in the same places, tripping up on the same things? Like, what's the deal? Like, I believe that God is sovereign in salvation, and I believe he's sovereign in how he transforms us. So why do I feel stuck? So that had really catalyzed the idea that what I want to do at a doctoral level is I want to think about transformation, particularly want to think about spiritual formation. How does God work in us to change us and transform us? And I was actually sitting with a group of pastors, there were about 25 of us on a retreat. And I was sharing with them, like, this is how I'm feeling, this is where I'm at. And as part of that, trying to narrow down the area of study, because they always say with your doctoral studies, you have to really keep narrowing it down to find something very specific. And with that group, as we were processing through, one of the things that I shared that I'd never really shared with anyone before was that I was feeling very lonely. I had this acute sense of being deeply alone. And I didn't know if that was a ministry thing, being a leader. I didn't know if it was a man thing, a husband. I just didn't know. I'm surrounded by amazing people, great staff and great people in our church, an amazing family, great kids, loving wife. What's the deal? Why am I so lonely? And in that space with that group of guys, it was actually a really beautiful moment where I realized, oh, I'm not alone. Other people feel this way. As those guys shared with me, well, actually, I feel lonely too. And another guy, well, I feel deeply lonely too. And so basically just the two worlds collided of I feel alone and I feel stuck. And what does friendship have to do with this whole journey? And so, those worlds came together. And in the end, it was actually almost as if it was like a commissioning moment where I had these pastors basically say, you need to go away and you need to dedicate yourself to this study. And you need to, on our behalf, you need to learn about this so that you can help us understand how do we figure out this loneliness piece and how do we grow again? How do we get moving forward, get unstuck?
That's fascinating. It would happen in that kind of context with people who are always around people, right? I mean, that's the job of a pastor. You're always connecting with people. Yeah. And so it's a fascinating place where that discussion would take place.
Totally. And I mean, I don't know if you can see in the little t-shirt that I'm wearing, but the project itself, I called Lonely But Not Alone. Because there was a real beautiful moment of realizing that actually so many of the people who do what I do feel the way that I feel. And maybe just what I had done was given them permission in that moment of vulnerability for them to come forward and say, me too, I need help with this. I'm lonely. Same thing. I'm with people all the time. I mean, I counted up one week, I had 1,000 conversations in a week. But yet still inside of me. So I wanted to know more. Where does that come from? What's going on there?
Interesting.
And, is this just a pastor thing or do other guys feel this?
Right. So I think we all understand that friendship's really a part of life. We've grown up with our own friends and everything else. But is there a picture of friendship that emerges as you start to study the scriptures?
That's the big question. And for me, Kirk, that was the kind of watershed moment, was realizing that the whole story of scripture is a story of friendship. So if you'll indulge me just for a moment or two, just to kind of share this with you. If you begin before creation, and most of us, if we go to church, hear sermons, believe the Bible, we know that there's this, triune God in eternity, Father, Son, Spirit, operating in relationship. And so we can affirm that God's this relational God. God functions in the context of relationship. And dive into creation itself. And what we learn is that creation is actually this generous outpouring of relationship, right? It's God making friendship happen in the cosmos. And that distills right down to this beautiful picture of Adam and Eve walking in the garden in the cool of the night, which is actually just a beautiful idea of friendship. If you want to know more about that, I'd encourage you to grab a copy of Mark Buchanan's book, God Walk, where he explores the theology of walking, which for someone like me who's a hiker was just a really beautiful piece of work. So I'd encourage you to do that. But obviously, there's the fall, and we all know what happens with the fall. Relationships broken, and friendship with God is ultimately broken. Drew Hunter, in his little book on spiritual friendship, says something that I think is really, really important. It is that sin is always antisocial. That's just a brilliant line to kind of hide in your own heart and realize sin's always antisocial. It always isolates us, breaks relationship, takes us away from others. And so we see that's the background picture to the whole Bible story. Now then God in his grace is calling people back to himself, right? Like the whole of the Old Testament is him inviting people back. And you'll be familiar, you're a pastor and a Bible teacher. God always calls people back to himself through covenants. And so you've got these covenants that unfold throughout all of the Old Testament. You've got covenant in the garden. It's the Adamic covenant. And then you've got a covenant with Noah. And you've got a covenant with Abraham and a covenant with Moses and then a covenant with David. And what's really critical to see there is, as you look through all of that, God always mediates his covenants through the people that he calls his friends. Like that, for me, that was like a light going on moment of realizing God instills these people as mediators between him and his people. And they're always people that he identified as his friends. So hold that thought for a moment. And then just before we kind of move towards the New Testament, I noted down one verse to share with you here because it's found in Isaiah 41. I think it's so important. The prophet says this, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend." So you got this, like, seems like a throwaway statement in the middle of a big prophetic book where God is identifying his people as his servants and he's identifying Abraham as his friend, right? So you got the covenant mediated by a friend. Now, fast forward to the upper room, to Jesus sitting around celebrating the Lord's Supper with his disciples. And he picks up this very idea. And then he says to his disciples, "I no longer call you servants, but friends." So you got this progression that goes from friendship in the garden in the fall to covenants being mediated by friends, all the way through to this beautiful, incredible New Testament moment where this new covenant arrives, right? Because that's what's happening in the upper room is Jesus is announcing a new covenant. Only this time his covenant isn't going to be mediated by a friend to servants, but it's going to be mediated to us as his friends, and we're going to be mediators of that in friendship. So you've actually got this huge climactic moment to this friendship in the Bible story where the God of the universe through his son Jesus is saying, "I don't call you servants anymore, I call you friends." That's a pretty big deal and a pretty big Bible moment as far as I'm concerned.
That's amazing, really. And it is, I'm still kind of going back to the quote that you gave a couple minutes ago about sin. How did you word that? Sin is
always antisocial.
So I'm thinking about COVID and everything that we've just been through over the last 18 months, and that comment, "Sin is always antisocial," as we start to come out of COVID. I'm thinking about people who really, they've kind of become a little bit comfortable with a new lifestyle of being a little bit antisocial. And what advice, so as a pastor, you're talking to somebody in your church or in your community who says, "Hey, I just don't think I really want to kind of go out with people. I don't need to be around people. I'm good just kind of being on my own." What advice do you give to them that links into this whole conversation about friendship and even that quote that you just gave?
Well, I'll say something because I'm just going to be, typical.
Because you're leaving the country anyway. So
but I would love to hear how you would do it as a pastor, because I think that would be really helpful for me. But the way I look at how the last 18 months have unfolded as a relational person myself, and I'm an extreme extrovert. My wife's extreme in the introversion world. So I kind of know both of the worlds pretty well, is that I think a couple of things have happened. I think that friendship in some ways is like a muscle, and I think it's atrophied for many people. It's like, I had broke my ankle at Christmas and spent 3 months in a boot cast, and I now have one large calf muscle and one skinny little leg that makes me look like a pirate. Like, that's because that muscle in just the space of a few weeks had completely atrophied and wasted away. And so I think some of us will have lost our sociability. We'll have forgotten how to do it because it is a skill set that we use and then we get better at. And so I think some of the advice I would be giving to people is go slow. Be like we were just talking before this podcast about going back to the gym. Like, don't go back in and start lifting heavy weights. Like, start to build things back up again. Don't dive back into those spaces because you're not going to have the emotional stability, or even the relational intelligence, to be able to navigate, just going back to where we were before. So that would be maybe the best advice I could give to people is let's just do this incrementally and slowly, and build those muscles back up again before you start flexing them. Because the other thing that I would say about how I've seen the last 18 months play out, and I've seen this in my own staff, I've seen this in many of my own relationships, and definitely watching my church, whether it's online interactions or just how they're navigating the world, is that at the moment we have a very low relational tolerance. And the way I'm describing that to people as I talk about relational capital is that we don't have relational capital. And so we're more unforgiving than we've ever been, more mean, more quick to speak. We're not listening. We're not paying attention to the other. And so I think for many people, it's like we need to go back to the drawing board and start, building this slowly. Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, I think that I would say to people, you need to be cautious between the difference between busyness and relationship as you start to go back into normal, whatever normal is going to look like. Because like around here where I live, the lineups are going to be big for restaurants. Like everybody wants to get back to being busy to some degree. But that's not the same thing as pursuing relationships. And so I think that I would caution people that be careful that you don't get caught in the trap that, frankly, it happened 100 years ago after the Spanish flu. Because after the Spanish flu happened, like we went straight into the roaring 20s because, the world had just come off of World War I. And then the Spanish flu, you had all these people who died, and there was all this pent up energy in the world to go live it up, to go, live to your maximum lifestyle. And, that ultimately blew up on the world because we hit the Great Depression. And so you cannot let history repeat itself. You can't just dive back into doing so much busyness and living it up at the expense of the relationships that God's calling you to form. At the same time, I would also just say to people, some of us have been in a bit of a COVID coma, and we quite like it. We kind of like the staying home and not interacting with people. And to your point, as you've talked about the theme of friendship throughout the scripture, I don't think that we can be faithful to all the things that God calls us to be as his people and live in isolation. I think that we have to put ourselves in environments where we're with people and building those types of relationships with each other, so we can live out things like the one another's in the New Testament. It's tough to live out the one another's of the New Testament on your own.
Yeah, that's good.
so and again, it depends, I think, on the personality of the person that I was talking to. And I would probably try to pastor them based on their personality, extrovert, introvert, how they would go. Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it's interesting even at a church level. I mean, people are often shocked by this, but I haven't even been with my staff since the start of COVID. We had one lunch together early on when we got together and sat, 25 meters apart. And after that, it was like, that didn't work. And so, I would even say as a staff, as much as we care for each other, we don't know how to be around each other.
Yep. And
so, we're going to have to relearn how to even do that as a bunch of professional, relational, pastoral people. And so, yeah, I think
it's true.
Some of us need some coaching.
So let's talk about we're talking about friendship kind of at a high level. Everybody kind of has used that word in their life, but what is the whole point of friendship? Like, what's the purpose? When we say friendships, what are we trying to accomplish?
Yeah. No, it's really good. So I'll try not to bore people with too much, psychobabble or anything like that. If they want, I can send you over a link to some videos where I unpack this with a little bit more, depth and thought. And we tie into like Aristotle, who was like the father of kind of friendship theory. And he really introduced the world to the idea that friendship's really about three things. It's about mutuality. It's about fun. It's also about I scratch your back, you scratch mine, let's look after each other. But ultimately, for Aristotle, who kind of shaped all of friendship theory for all of history, including, how Paul the Apostle thought about friendship and things like that. He would have studied the classics and been shaped in that world. For Aristotle, the main point of friendship was character formation. It was so that we would grow as humans in the world. Now, just to kind of bring this into some kind of Christian theological kind of concept, for me, I think instantly think of Romans 8:29. So let me just read it. It says, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his son." And most people only break out that verse to have some sort of debate about, Reformed theology. And, that's fantastic. That's not for now. And I'm pretty sure, Kirk, we'd probably find we line up pretty well on some of that stuff. I'd say we're probably both 4-point Calvinists. Mm-hmm. We just don't want to be grumpy. So we're not going to be 5-point.
That's right.
But a beautiful scripture that's hard to unpack, and we'll always go back and forth and debate the whole predestination, election, all that stuff. That's kind of like, for me, that's an important part of it. But what's often missed, I think, in those verses is why. Like, why is God doing a salvation work in the world? And it says it so clearly in those verses. It's so that we are conformed to the image of his son. So no matter where you line up on the whole salvation piece, election, predestination, all that stuff, that's for another debate. But something that I think you can't debate in that text is that the very purpose for why God is working his saving work in the world is so that we are transformed to the image of his son. Like, that's a non-negotiable in the text. So, I think you can reverse engineer so much out of that to know, okay, if God's work in me is to shape and form Jesus, and his work in Kirk Giles is to shape and form Jesus, then how does he do that? How does he mediate that transforming work in our lives? And I would say in two ways: his saving grace and then common grace. And in my thinking, and again, I'm still forming my ideas around this, I think friendship fits really well into both of those spaces. Most people, and you'll know this as someone who's led a large evangelistic organization, most people come to know Christ through their friends. Like, God mediates his salvation work through friendships. I came to know Jesus, and there was a guy at the end of the day who preached a message and I responded to it. But the reason I was in that very room was because some friends had been journeying with me, praying for me, inviting me, so God works friendship into our lives in order to even flush out his salvation purposes. But then also, I think he interjects friendship into our lives as a means of common grace, as a way to reveal his goodness, as a way to work in us and change us and transform us. And, and probably then just to push that a little bit further, and where this really came alive in my studies was in paying attention to the fact that, when we think about growing and changing and, to use a Bible or theological idea, sanctification, we tend to go to some default spiritual practices, right? And you could rhyme them off: read the Bible, pray, fast, solitude, all those things. One of the things that I have really accepted and believe wholeheartedly is that friendship itself is a spiritual practice. It's a discipline that's as important as solitude, reading your Bible, prayer. It's actually a practice that we enter into. And if you mine your way through church history, you'll find that people way smarter than me arrived at exactly the same place. And even some of the reformers, Calvin himself wrote some really important letters to his friends where he affirmed the same thing, but for friendship, and how God was using people to transform us, not just his word, not just his spirit, but actually his word and his spirit in relational context.
Wow. I think most of us probably don't think of friendship in that light, because we tend to think about just the fun part, right? Like, I want some people I can hang around with and have some fun with. But as you link that to God's work in our life of conforming us to the image of Jesus, I think that is very profound for all of us to really think about. And when I think about Jesus, I think about, so if I'm going to be conformed to the image of Jesus, then I also want to make sure that I'm learning to do friendships the way Jesus did friendships, right? Like that's part of being conformed to the image of Jesus. So in your studies, were there some things that we could pick up from Jesus about how to do friendships?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll share these with you, and most people will probably be like, oh, I already knew that. I just hadn't really thought about it. One of the things that I've enjoyed with my family actually over the last season has been watching The Chosen. I don't know if you've been watching that show, but it's beautifully put, like, this virtual reality or three-dimensional vision of how Jesus was around people that I find to be personally really helpful and inspiring. But the significant learning for me was actually through a piece of work called Deep Mentoring, which I think is a book that every Christian should have in their collection. It's just a little paperback, nothing too heavy, written by two American guys, Randy Reese, who has passed away since then, and Rob Lone. And Rob actually was one of my doctoral faculty, and then Randy's wife, Susan, as well. So they both served to help guide me through this. But in that work, Deep Mentoring, Randy and Rob, what they did was they took the New Testament, every encounter, I shouldn't say the New Testament, the Gospels, every encounter that Jesus had with another person, they documented it and then exegeted it and tried to understand, how did Jesus practice relational life? And the work that they did is really, really fantastic and very, very helpful. And they identified 4 ways that they see Jesus do friendship. The first is deepening. So Jesus took every opportunity and every conversation to try to open things up. So you'll know that from studying the Gospels, Jesus is a master at asking questions. He even answers people's questions with other questions. And so he always looks for every relational opportunity as an opportunity to walk deeper into someone's life, walk deeper into someone's story. So you've got that deepening piece. The second is particularizing, like Jesus' ability to adapt to the person. Like, so you mentioned already, I pay attention to whether someone's an extrovert or an introvert. Those are important moments in relational intelligence. But it's amazing how many people don't think about that. They don't pay enough attention to the person that's in front of them. Jesus does. It's very evident in how Jesus can adapt his communication style. How can he adapts what he says, the way in which he says it. He is paying attention. So each encounter is very particular. And the third, which is beautiful, is the fact that Jesus always practices friendship in the context of hospitality. Now, that in itself is worthy of a whole bunch of sermons. What is hospitality and what is it not? But I think one of the things that we as Christians need to do is we need to kind of take apart and crush the idea that hospitality is having people in our homes, as much as that might be a part of it. I know when I have people in my home, it's a frantic, tidy it up, make it look like everything's perfect. We'll just invite them into the good room, bring it the good plates. It's a totally different, for the most part, it's a very constructed environment. Jesus is a master of hospitality, and yet the scripture says that he didn't own a home. The Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head. So that in itself begs the question, how do you practice hospitality if you don't have a place? And, when you look at Jesus and how he practiced hospitality, for me, my conclusion was that hospitality is actually something else. It's creating a safe place and a sacred time. And all of us can create a safe place and sacred time for people. We can do that in McDonald's. We can do that for a walk in the park. We can do that for a drive in the car. We can do that in the golf course. It's actually about how we intentionally create the space around people. Is it safe? And is it sacred? And then the final piece, which is really helpful, particularly for those of us who are pastors, because we get frustrated, right? Like, why are people not changing? Come on. That was the best sermon ever. I can't believe Jesus didn't even just come back. That was the one he could have landed on. Is that Jesus's ability and how he relates to others is deeply patient. Like he is just so patient with people, way more than I am, way more than you are, way more than we are as a people, a Christian people, is Jesus's ability to be patient with the people that he's interacting with. So those four things are really things that I've embedded and embodied into my life and trying to shape how I move forward relationally.
That is such a great perspective around how Jesus went about interacting with the people around him. I've not heard it put into that language before, but I really appreciated that. That I found to be very helpful. One of the things
Kirk, could I just
yeah, go
jump
ahead.
back in there?
Yeah.
When I moved to Canada, so that was 10 years ago, I was in Alberta, I was in Calgary, and pastoring a big church in the university area. And almost all the people in the church were engineers, just part of being in the oil and gas kind of sector, which meant that they, for the most part, were all introverted males. And I remember jokingly saying to one of the other pastors, I think at some point we're going to have to preach a series to help people learn how to do relational life, how to be friends, because as an extrovert, I was just dying on my feet because everywhere I went, I was just encountering these introverted engineer guys. And I was just, spending all my energy and getting nothing back. And I've grown a lot since those days, but in understanding how to even lead and manage and interact with introverts. But I do think there's something here of going, it's probably helpful for us as pastors to begin to think about how can we take this Jesus model and equip people around that. You could take each one of those and, take an Impactus Bible study, and talk about what does it mean to deepen? How do we deepen the relationships and so forth?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And even just learning questions to ask people. My small group gets really annoyed with me because I just keep asking them questions instead of giving them answers. And they're like, would you just answer a question already? I'm like, no, I'm just going to keep asking you questions.
That's awesome.
I said, I just want to be like Jesus. That's all I want. One of the things that I've noticed for us as people is we tend towards having friendships with people who are very similar to who we are. So, if I like a particular sport or hobby, I tend to surround myself with people who like the same things. Or if I have a theological perspective, I tend to surround myself with people who think the same way. I mean, social media exists because the algorithms are all about connecting you with people who think like you, right? And so the question I have is, like, should we also have friends who are not like us? Is there any benefit to that?
That's a great question. I'd love to know what you think about that. I mean, whenever I think about it, I'm instantly thinking about, well, the two things that come to my mind are capacity and character. Like one of the things that really came to light for me during my doctoral studies, which was really humbling, but I needed to admit the fact that I have limitations. Relationally, I have limitations. In fact, not only do I have limitations, God has designed the world to function with limitations. For me, I just thought I could just keep adding and adding and adding and adding more and more and more people to the world called Stephen McCready's relational network. But actually that was just really naive, and so having to come to terms with capacity is a huge thing. I really appreciate Larry Osborne and the work he's done in his book, Sticky Church, where he talks about, being relational churches and being connected. And he uses that little illustration of the Lego blocks. Some people are like the little 2-piece, and some people like the 4-piece, and some people like the long strip. And then there are some people that are like the big green mat that all the bits connect on. But no matter where you are, whether you're a 2-piece or a 60-piece, you still have to face your limitations. And so I think that's a helpful place to start, to be like, okay, well, if I only have capacity for this amount of people, who should those people be? And if I'm a Christian and I'm really serious about God's work in my life, and I know that the purpose of his friendship is for me to be transformed and to grow into his image, then I need to really think about, if I've only got 6 blocks, who I fill those 6 blocks up with. So yeah, that's a piece. And then the second's just character. I think there are some people who actually thrive in space where they're around a bunch of people that aren't like them. I would actually classify myself in that space. So, I think it's part of being a missionary, is that you intentionally invade spaces of people who aren't necessarily like you. And so for me, I work at a gym, and, I surround myself with yoga instructors and all those, like I can comfortably put myself into spaces like that, because I can understand it's part of how God has wired Steve McCready. But I also know that here's my wife, and she's not like that at all. And, and so it'd be wrong for me to say, well, you need to do that and be more like this. So I think it's always a good thing for all of us to try to be reflective practitioners and do a little bit of an inventory around who am I, and even what season of life am I in. If I am a young parent, realistically, my capacity is shriveled right now because I got little kids, but I probably will only be around other young parents, and that's okay. So yeah, I think a friendship itself is a really important practice alongside the spiritual discipline of wisdom.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Man, we could keep talking for a while, but we're running out of time. I did want to ask you this question though. A lot of men tend to really struggle with building friendships. It's one of the things in all the years I've worked with men, it's one of the things that comes up over and over and over again, is men have a hard time developing close friendships. They've got lots of acquaintances, they've got lots of people in their life, but there is that sense of loneliness that men feel. And here's some of the things that I've observed and what I've heard. I've heard guys talk about how busy they are, and so they just don't have time to build the friendships. The reality of family, like you just talked about, right? Like if you've got little kids, when do you have spare time to invest in building friendships? Your capacity is limited. Guys who are they can't find men that they can trust. That's another piece. And tied into that is I've met a lot of men, and I put myself in this boat where, like, you want to have deeper levels of conversation, but it seems like the guys that you take the risk on to have deeper levels of conversation with, the walls go up, and those guys don't want to enter into the deeper levels of conversation. So what advice would you give to men who they've tried to develop friendships, like they're listening to you and they're going, yes, Steve, yes, I get it. I understand it. I believe it. I'm with you. I want to build those kinds of friendships in my life, but I just can't find them anywhere. Yeah. My church sticks me in a small group, and frankly, none of the guys in my small group want to talk about anything other than their work. And it's just, I feel stuck. Like, what advice would you give to guys who are in that spot?
That's a great question, Kirk, and probably a great place to kind of wrap up as well, and just kind of land the conversation, to leave it with guys to go away and do a bit of thinking about. I mean, the one thing I would love to just, for every guy that's listening to this, to just make a peace with, is the fact that you are lonely. Like, that was a huge moment for me of just realizing, okay, it's not just a feeling. Loneliness is more than that. Henry Nouwen, who you'll be familiar with, he says it so wonderfully. He says that loneliness is our woundedness. And so that's what it is to be human. So number one, let me humanize how you're feeling, and also say you might be lonely, but you're not alone. And I think for guys, that's a really helpful, place to begin that conversation. But to get practical then, and to move forward, let me just share steps from my own life. And they're going to sound like Sunday school kind of cliche stuff, but sometimes that's the best stuff, For me, the starting place was prayer. And let me just explain that a little bit. For the longest time in my life, I didn't really consider, when I prayed to Jesus, that what I was doing was relating to a friend. Once I had theologically made my peace that Jesus calls me his friend, that I'm not his servant, I'm his friend, then that changed what prayer was like for me, because I realized that I am interacting with the ultimate friend. And then the second part of that was realizing that it's okay to talk to Jesus about something like friendship, because again, for the longest time I had thought that just feels like something that teenagers would struggle with, and teenage girls to boot, like a 40-year-old man doesn't struggle with friendship. But it was a significant moment for me to just, in the place of prayer, to just say, Jesus, I'm really lonely and I could really use a friend. And could you, just being able to know that I could talk to him about that was a really amazing starting place. And from those early days, seeing how God has answered that prayer and put some guys in my life. So I'd pray about it. Put yourself out there. Like, that's the other thing I would say to guys. The world has changed immensely. When I became a pastor and started doing weddings like 15, 20 years ago, everybody met in youth group, or they met in high school. Pretty much every wedding I take today, a couple have met online.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them have even met online playing Call of Duty together, and they're the most interesting weddings. But, how and where we connect has changed. Mm-hmm. And I think we haven't adapted quick enough as guys to realize that. We're still using some of the old ways of thinking. And so I just encourage guys, like, put yourself out there, like, you have to if you want to, and so it could just be reaching out to a guy, and I encourage them. And there's nowhere safer than a text message or a messenger, because people just don't have to respond, and so I've actually personally reached out to some guys and just said, hey, would you be interested in getting together to go for a walk? And then being pleasantly surprised that on the other side of that are usually other lonely guys who are like, oh, I would really love that. So putting yourself out there, I think is huge. I tend to think that this whole space falls into two categories of people. There are those who are intentional about it and those who are sitting back thinking that it's just going to happen and expecting others to come and pursue their friendship, and so I just try to encourage guys, why not be that guy, so pray about it, put yourself out there, and then practice it. Like, just, it's a spiritual practice. It's the same as reading your Bible. And so you start, you're not very good at it. It gets better. It gets easier, you just have to, just keep moving forward. Let me just share you one story with a COVID experience of a guy in our church who would get, trying to think of an appropriate way to say it in a podcast. He would drink too much on a Friday night, and then he would send me a bunch of really nasty messages about how nobody from the church had called him. None of the pastors had reached out to him, and he was all alone in the world. And this would just be consistent week after week. And even though I would then spend, 2 hours on a Friday night when I'm supposed to be with my family, messaging them, all that kind of stuff, it just wasn't enough. And then in the end, I just, I basically called him out on it, but I said to him, why are you waiting on someone to phone you? Why don't you phone someone? And he messaged me the next day to say that he took my advice seriously. And he reached out to a guy, he got the church phone book out. He reached out to a guy, just made a call, and he found on the other end a really lonely guy. And the two of them have struck up a beautiful friendship. They phone each other every day to check in on each other, because they're both older guys who, are feeling like a better stay home to stay safe type thing. And they've struck up a wonderful friendship, and they've been moving forward for these last few months in that space. So, it's not rocket science, but at the same time, it does take a little bit of fuel to kind of get the thing moving forward.
That's such great advice. And I'll add one more thing into that, one more idea for guys. When I think about how Jesus started his friendship with the men that he called friends, it started by him calling them into a mission. He just said, hey, we're going to, like, you follow me, I'm going to make you fishers of men. He didn't start out by saying, follow me and we'll be great friends. He said, follow me and I'm going to make you fishers of men. And so get yourself involved in serving with other men. Put yourself in environments where
I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, where you're on mission together with other guys. And as you go on mission, watch how God forges your friendship with each other.
Oh, absolutely. And right down to the practical side of mission, like, one of the things that I've discovered through my research work is that men grow better side by side than they do across a table. Yep. So women thrive sitting across a coffee table, but men don't. But stick two men on a wall with a hammer and some nails and watch how those relationships flourish. And so I've tried to talk to our church here, and maybe for the guys to start thinking about this for their churches too, is like, I think the future of missions trips isn't youth ministry. I think it's men. loading up their cars with, toolboxes and sheets of drywall and just going and find something to do and do it together, but side by side.
Yep. I totally agree. Well, this has been great, Steve.
Kirk, can I just say one thing? Because I think that, there might be some pastors that are listening, some leaders, but you threw out a word that I think is really important. So I just want to double back to that to kind of, one of the main pieces that came out of my research work was realizing that for pastors in particular and leaders, but probably for all men, is that the number one defining thing that they're looking for in a friendship is safety. It needs to be safe. If there's even a hint or a sniff that you're not a safe guy, then they're not going to go there. And so I just, again, would be encouraging guys, do whatever needs to happen in your heart with the level of integrity that you offer to become that safe guy for someone, because if they even, get a hint that you're not, they're not going to go there. That's just bottom line.
Yeah, that's good word. Steve, thank you so much for sharing this today. Really appreciate having you on the podcast with us. And men, as you've been listening today, I hope that you've been encouraged by this conversation, that you will take to heart some of this great wisdom from Steve today. You'll see the value in building these kinds of friendships in your life, and that you'll take the steps to do it, because, man, friendships can be so life-giving and life-shaping for you and for your family by default, as God shapes you through your friends. So God bless you, men. We'll talk to you next time on the podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Impactus podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.